If you listen to international news from mostly non-American news stations and news outlets, then you get some perspective. I heard recently the United States committed to giving $40 million to 3 African countries over 3 years in order to promote peace and understanding and democracy and fight ISIS. $40 million to 3 countries over 3 years. Israel gets $40 million every 4 days. And it's a completely developed country. It doesn't need the money. It's not like a poor developing country. So that gives us some perspective. So nobody really can say that they're neutral in this country because unless we are actively opposing Israel, unless we are actively engaged in this issue of Palestine, then we're supporting Israel. That's the reality. One of the reasons that people find this issue so confusing is that there's never any context. So suddenly there's rockets flying out of Gaza, and Hamas is trying to kill Israelis. Suddenly Israel invades this place or that place, and there's violence and there's bombing, and there's really never any context. It all seems like it's just out of thin air. So I'm going to try to provide some context, and this might be a little bit of a history lesson as well. The reality is that we have a country that has 2 names. 2 nations live there, Israelis and Palestinians, but the life of everyone is governed and run by the state of Israel. And that is the reality. So it's an occupation, it's an oppression. It's not a question of war that should be resolved through peace talks. Now, like I said before, one of the problems is that there's never any context. This happens, that happens. There's violence here, there's violence there, there's rockets out of Gaza. All these different things are happening, but there's never any context. Now, people always talk about this issue as though it's been going on for thousands of years. Those people over there, they've been killing each other forever. It's intractable. It's not something that we can ever in our lifetime expect to be resolved. And I think if we're really honest about wanting to find the roots for this conflict, why there is this conflict in Palestine, I think it's fair to say that we can look to the racism and colonialism that were brought to Palestine mostly from Europe. In Israel, they talk about the Balfour Declaration. You may have heard of the Balfour Declaration. The Balfour Declaration, and they treat it as though it is one of the 10 Commandments. Every city in Jerusalem, every city in Israel has a Balfour Street. You would think that Balfour was one of the prophets. And it's that, it's that prominent. And when you look right down at it, Balfour was the Foreign Secretary of Great Britain, and he gave a note promising that His Majesty's government supports basically the idea of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. None of these men were from Palestine or really had anything to do with Palestine, but between Lord Balfour and this Jewish millionaire by the name of Rothschild, they decided that it was okay to take somebody else's country and give it to the Jews. This was a world where you could do things like that. People who were white and European could take the countries of people who were brown and not European and do as they will. And basically that's what the Balfour Declaration is. One white racist promising another white racist somebody else's country. Now, we move forward several decades, and then we have the United Nations deciding to partition Palestine. It's called the Partition of Palestine, because some people say there was never a Palestine, so how could there be the Partition of Palestine? And that was on November the 29th, 1947. And the map of the Partition of Palestine is this. And besides the fact that the boundaries look absurd, and there's nothing doable about these boundaries. It's a complete mess. There's something else that is troubling about the map, about this idea of the partition. At that time, at the end of 1947, the entire Jewish community in Palestine numbered only about 500,000 people. The local native Palestinian population was 3 times as many, about 1.5 million people. But the partition plan gives the Jewish community the larger portion of the land. And to this day, we hear people say, this is all the Palestinians' fault because they rejected the partition plan. who would not reject a plan like this? I mean, besides the fact that nobody really asked them, but how could anybody not reject a plan? Now, the majority of the Jewish community in Palestine at the time were the generation of my grandparents who had immigrated to Palestine, and then the generation of my parents who were born there, the first generation Israelis, if you will. You know, really basically a community of people who just came off the boat. And the United Nations felt that they could give these people the majority or the larger portion of the land. Now, this is very troubling for many, many reasons. Beyond that, at that point, or from that point on, we have two narratives that emerge. Almost literally from that moment on in history. We have two narratives that are diametrically opposed. We have two histories that are diametrically opposed. So they don't differ in nuance. It's not like we can bridge them. When you accept one, you have to reject the other. We have one narrative that talks about heroism and the revival of the Jewish people. And we have one narrative that talks about occupation and ethnic cleansing. Now go bridge that gap. Now, the narrative or the story that I learned as an Israeli, and most people learn in America and in the West in general, is a story that talks about, like I said, the revival of the Jewish people only several years after the Holocaust. They tried to develop their own state. They were attacked by the Arabs immediately after the partition plan. They were attacked by the Arabs. Thankfully, they were quick on their feet, and they were a little bit smarter and more advanced than these Arabs, so they were able to defeat them and conquer most of the country and establish a homeland for the Jewish people after 2,000 years in the land of Israel. Now, you go argue with a story that is so romantic, and it's like another chapter out of the Bible. You know, it is so powerful, it is so romantic, and it fits in really well with, thinking, Christian thinking and colonial thinking and so forth. It kind of makes, it's a story that why would you refute, why would you argue? The problem is, of course, that like every story, it's got some problems with it. And about 20 or so years ago, several Israeli historians began to look into this history, this version of the history. And Ilan Pape is probably the chief among those, but there are several others. And they found several problems, one of which is that, like I said, at that time, there was a rather small Jewish community in Palestine and a rather big local Palestinian community. But by the end of 1947, the Jewish community in Palestine had managed to develop a very strong armed militia, a fighting force. That militia, that fighting force, numbered about 40,000 trained armed men. And there was no equivalent on the other side. There never was. There was no real Palestinian militia, real Palestinian armed force. So the question that begs to be asked is, then who are these Arabs that attacked the Jews? Because if the story is that the Arabs attacked, then who are they and what did they attack with? When the United Nations accepted this partition resolution, it was the Zionists, it was it was the Jewish militia, the Zionist militia, that began the assault. And it was an assault that lasted a year, or about a year, at the end of which hundreds and hundreds of Palestinian towns and villages were destroyed. Close to 1 million Palestinians were forced into exile. And almost the entire country was conquered by this Jewish militia, by the Zionist militia. Now, there's two interesting things about this. Number one, Palestinians have been saying this from the very beginning, but nobody can believe Palestinians because they're Arabs and they're probably liars. So we can't trust them. But when an Israeli historian says this, now people are paying attention, especially an Israeli historian with German background.